Thank you. So really shortly, and just to give the sense of where are we in Europe, and then to move back to here and to see what the main gap. So looking from 10,000 feet, Europe compared to US and Silicon Valley, unfortunately there is still a huge gap. And the huge gap is the one that is written over there. That is, we still have just a few European startups that scale. The number that you see here are what are called the billion-dollar startup clubs, namely known as also unicorns. You know that in the startup world we've been hit by a sort of obsessive, compulsive unicorn disease. Everybody is talking about unicorns. Now we talk also about dragons, centurions. Looks like to be a bit in the Games of Thrones episode, right? And still, so the bad news for today that all these animals do not exist. But the good news that some companies are growing and growing and growing, and this company are the one that we really care about because they're the one that produce revenue, employment, and innovation at scale. And if you look at this kind of companies, you can see that just a few of them are from Europe. Robin will present different data from different sources, also depend how you measure these animals, if you just look at the public, private, but still there is a gap. The good news is that there are in Europe just a few unicorns, maybe, but there are a lot of what you can call them unicorn falls, meaning startups that are finally start growing and growing, and are positioning themselves in a position to be able to scale up even more and become relevant. And so I think that in terms of startups in Europe, most of the work has been done and the gap is definitely closer. We have plenty of startups everywhere, really everywhere. Not just in Berlin, London, Paris, and Madrid, everywhere. The gap is still in terms of startups that are able to raise money and start growing, what we call them the scale-ups. And if you look at the numbers, this is an analysis that we are doing as Tech.eu partnership. We are focusing currently just on ICT, so this number that you see focus only on ICT and focus only on 5 countries, so they are not totally representative. I'll give you the sense. The good news is that we have at least 1,000 scale-ups. Companies were able to raise $1 million. This is the minimal floor to become, to be positioned to become relevant as growing. And cumulatively, they raised $23 billion. And this is a good starting point. And there is an additional 40 that were able to raise 100 million. That is definitely a higher ceiling, and it's definitely a sign that is something really moving in the right direction. Second data that I'd like to share to you is that Europe is not all over the same. And so if you look at this number, you look where these scale-ups came from, you see that most of them come from the UK, but beyond the numbers, UK scale-ups are the double that we want to find in Germany and in France. You see that the amount of capital they were able to raise is definitely higher. There's a big multiplier between that differentiates UK scale-ups from German scale-ups and from French scale-up and from Spanish scale-ups and from Italian scale-ups. Sorry for that, but that's the order. And the main difference is still the access to not just venture capital funds that are pretty growing elsewhere in Europe, mostly more in Germany and UK, but mostly to the stock market. The stock market is still the big differentiation between UK, beyond the cultural environment, and the other countries. The final number that I like to share, because I don't want to kill you with too much numbers and we don't have that much time, is the number of acquisitions. So there is life on Planet Scale-ups also in terms of acquisition. You know, in Europe, acquire a company, sell a company is not perceived as a final goal, as in here, but it's mostly perceived as sort of giving up. And so there is still a cultural gap, both on the startup side, they don't like to think that they're doing something to be sold, and on the corporate side, also large corporate not have the acquisition attitude that we have in here. But still, there is something that is moving on that way. We recognize approximately 400 M&As just in ICT in the last 5 years. Robin has more data about that. But just one that I want to share with you, and is, okay, a European startup has been acquired. Where it goes? Who is the acquirer? And you see is just a few of them remains in their own country. Most of them are acquired by the other European countries, but the real differentiator are acquired from the US. So US appetite for European startups is pretty high. 44% of the European scale-ups have been acquired by US companies. So it looks like that you like our stuff.
Thank you, Alberto. Sorry.
I don't know if this...
Can I do mic, please?
It works.
Thank you. Just before Robin kicks off, a comment here. It's important to understand that in Europe, the majority of these startups are not being formed out of the university systems. That's very, very big difference between US, Silicon Valley, and Europe. So there's huge upside potential in Europe once many universities increasingly come online. I was in Austria 2 weeks ago. The total number of spin-outs from Austrian universities is between 10 and 15 a year today. So this is a sector of the European economy that's really underperforming compared to the top US universities, and where I think we'll see a lot of upside in the years to come. Robin, on to you.
Thank you. So just for context, my name's Robin. I've been covering the European tech scene for about 7 years, for TechCrunch first, the Next Web second, and now for my own publication called Tech.eu. So what I've seen, especially in the last 3 years, has been pretty phenomenal. The pace of growth and the momentum that you see in different European startup ecosystems is really something to take into account, take notice of. I'm going to present some slightly different data, but with very similar conclusions. The first is research done by Atomico, which is a global investment firm. It was started by one of the founders of Skype. So they invest all over the world, but to learn about which region they should be focusing on, they went back all the way to 2003, and they actually analyzed all the unicorns, the $1 billion plus valued software companies, and came up with this really nice research that you can go to their website, and it's actually quite interactive. I took some screenshots just for to make my life easier. So they've counted about 182. This is slightly outdated. We're getting close to about 200 unicorns worldwide, according to their count. For context, more than half of those are in the United States, not just in Silicon Valley, obviously. About 33% of those 182 that they tracked are actually in the Valley, which is a phenomenal number, but it still means that 2/3 of these companies that were started all the way back since 2003 are not in Silicon Valley, which tells you something. And the most interesting part about Europe is that the number is relatively low. It's about 16% at last count. Of those worldwide unicorns, we have about 29 at the time they did the research. We have about 35 now. If that slightly contrasts into what Alberto was presenting, the 12 unicorns, is because we also include places like Russia, Turkey, the Balkans, Israel, which is not European Union, but it's part of the European tech scene as far as we are concerned. So we're getting close to about 35 unicorns, which is still, as Alberto very correctly pointed out, a huge gap between the rest of the world. But the gap between the Valley and the rest of the world in terms of number of unicorns is really, really quickly getting wider, which doesn't necessarily mean anything about the beauty and the magic of Silicon Valley, but it means something about the globalization that we have, and the fact that you can really build a great company anywhere. So that's research from Atomico. We also do our own research at Tech.eu. I wanted to cycle through it very quickly, so I just put up one slide with a number of statistics, which you can easily just read. But we're basically on course to raise European tech companies are on course to raise about $10 billion this year. We tracked about 3.5 billion euros raised in Q2 alone. So it shouldn't be too hard to get to that 10 billion number. This is by far a record. You have to go back to 2000, 2001 to get quarterly statistics that are as high. But then it fell really quickly. So the fact that we have a very consistent pace on a quarterly basis means growth. It means momentum. And that's something that international investors also really like. So we're starting to see more influx of US and Asian VCs investing in European tech companies. We also see a lot more money going to European VCs. They've raised 2 billion euros in Q2 alone. I think the number in Q3 will actually be higher than that. It's also record-breaking. So that means that the money's not just going increasingly into tech companies, it's also increasingly going to new funds and also new VC firms. There's a whole new generation of VCs emerging, particularly in UK and Germany. Good exits, Alberto already pointed this out. There is a lot of M&A activity. It's only picking up. We tracked about 80 billion euros worth of exits last year. I should point out that it includes telco and ICT, so the huge consolidation wave helped. But it also means that if you look at the number that we tracked for Q2, which is 48 billion euros, is already more than half than we had for 2014 in total. So really good momentum. And the last thing I want to point out is that 97% of the unicorns, as we like to call them, another term to mock, were founded in 2011 or earlier, which means that all the momentum that we've been seeing in the last 3-4 years is only going to result in more of these huge companies being built, because it takes in between 6 to 7 years to really build a billion-dollar company in general. So the generation of startups, the really high-quality startups that we see surfacing today that are raising these big rounds, is really, really big rounds. Spotify's $526 million round, et cetera. So we're going to see a lot more of those, and that's it.
Great. Thank you, Robin. So Alberto and Robin have covered the European scene. Sean Randolph of Bay Area Council is going to give us an overview of the Valley and a little bit of a comparison.
Great. I'll borrow the clicker. So what I have to say will be very consistent with what you've just heard, but I'm going to flip a little bit to look at it from the Bay Area, Silicon Valley side. So we have here within the region the largest entrepreneurial community and the largest investor risk capital community in the world. And there is a phenomenal infrastructure, and I think this is really great news for everybody in the room, that is here specifically to support startups and early stage companies coming from Europe. So what you see there is just a partial list, but there's a growing number of incubators and accelerators, some with a pan-European focus, some with a national focus, that are here to support European companies coming through. There's a range of technology connectors. I guess you could call them technology or innovation outposts or scouting offices that very often are representing major European companies that are here because they have figured out one way or the other that even though they may have a large R&D budget, very often they are being out-innovated by much younger companies, many of whom are here. So they're augmenting their own essentially in-house R&D with partnering with a large tech company here, but also doing a constant scan for startups from the US, but all from around the world, including many, many from Europe, so that they can identify what companies may have a technology or a business model that can augment theirs, can add to it, or that in other circumstances could actually bring it down. And we've heard before that the pace of change is so fast that even if you're a large incumbent and you have a big market share and you've got a big budget, that can change very, very quickly in today's technology world. So even the large players are on the lookout for startups who can help them advance their business model, or at least let them know what they need to adjust to if that model is under threat. And you can see a lot of large European companies here, as well as European government agencies that are here specifically or to a large degree to connect to or identify startups, many of them from Europe. So we've got to ask, why are there so many startups from Europe here? We don't know how many are here. Probably on any given day, a fair guess might be upwards of 300. This week, there's obviously a lot more. So what draws them here, or the flip side of that question, is what tends to push them out of Europe in this direction? Well, one of the big topics we've already started to talk about is risk capital. So the venture industry was basically created here in this region. Historically, about a third of all the venture investment in the US has taken place within about 50 miles of where we are today. The last 2 years, that has grown. In 2014, in the first half of 2015, something over 50% of all the venture investment in the US was taking place within 40 or 50 miles of here. So you can see there how the numbers have grown. But the volume of venture investment available in Europe, it has been quite flat. It's been, depending on how you count it, about 20% of what's available in the US. But you can see, even though it's maintaining itself, the amount of risk capital available here has gone up tremendously in the last 2 to 3 years. And you could say that's a risk. There's a lot of money floating around. But there's a famous story about somebody interviewed years ago, a bank robber. And they said, why do you rob banks? And he said, well, it's where the money is. So a lot of folks come here because the risk capital is here. And it's not just the venture money, but as we heard earlier, it's angels of all scales, super angels, private equity is getting in the game, corporate venture is also growing very rapidly too. And then the question is, where does it come from? And there's a real difference between typically a US venture-funded project and something European. You can see here that over 90% of the equity coming into venture capital in the US is private money. Because there isn't as much private money going into risk capital in Europe, government has stepped in and plays a much larger role, essentially filling some of that gap. But these are different relationships. If you're working with a private investor who also becomes a mentor and has equity in you and brings resources to support you, that's a bit of a different story than what you might find if you have a government grant. And then there's some other issues that I talked to a lot of European startups over the years about, so besides capital, what's drawing you here? And there's a bunch of things. And this is what they tell me anyway. I'd love to hear it from you as well, if this is right or not. One is geographical fragmentation. So we in America think of Europe as a single market, and maybe it is for goods, but not for services. Every national system has its own regulations that apply to startups, which adds costs to scaling within Europe. In the venture market, it's pretty balkanized. If you're in Italy, you're probably not going to get venture investment from someplace else in Europe. So there isn't a pan-European market for venture that would scale. We heard a little bit about acquisition culture. If your exit strategy is to be acquired, a lot of European companies have not historically grown through acquisition. A lot of Silicon Valley companies deliberately grow through rapid acquisition. So if that's your exit strategy, it's a big one. Collaborative culture, we heard earlier about the importance of trust, lowering barriers to people moving between companies and institutions, the willingness to share ideas, the risk culture, the willingness to accept failure. University culture, universities here have a track record of being open to and actively encouraging people, faculty and students, to go off campus to start companies. And finally, you've got, in some companies, taxation is an issue, labor policy, where some companies you have to bring labor in on your decisions. If you reach 50 employees, maybe you don't want to go to 50 employees that way. And also the fact that IPOs are not as, stock options are not as widely used because often they're taxed when they're awarded, and even before they're utilized, and that's often at ordinary tax rates.
Okay.
So the final word is that the good news is when companies come here, they tend to grow both at home and in Europe. We're a crazy expensive place to hire engineers. There's plenty of talent in Europe, and the companies that succeed end up being many multinationals, one foot in Europe, one in Silicon Valley.
Thanks, Sean. We've got 30 seconds left. One of the big structural differences between Europe and the Valley US is the M&A marketplace. Level of M&A transactions, numbers of transactions is 10%, depending upon what numbers you look at. So, and it has a big impact on the valuation of companies in Europe. So Robin and then Alberto, what do you see happening in terms of the gap in M&A between Europe and the US? Where do you see that going?
It is really a problem, that's true. So we did some research on all the exits that we saw in 2014. Alberto was exactly on the money. It was 44% of companies buying European tech are American. Of all the countries in the world, 44% is US companies buying European tech because the valuations are lower, it's easier and cheaper to get talent on board. Lots of reasons for international expansion of their own business is also one of the reasons. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. Although I would argue that the corporate acquisition culture in Europe is really bad. That's not something that we are going to change. It's not going to happen, at least not overnight. So we might as well just make the best out of US companies buying European.
So I disagree with you on that last statement, Robin, but let's move on to Alberto.
Okay. Hopefully you will agree with me. I'm saying that is a problem of time. I think that open innovation has been a well-spoken word in Europe, but just a few of them were really doing that. What we are seeing as Tech.eu partners is that we have even more corporates that are seriously approaching the startup ecosystem with the purpose of buying business, making investment, making acquisition. I think it's time. Startup world started in Europe 10 years ago. Now we are seeing the first scale-ups, we are seeing the first unicorns, and we will see probably the first M&A market. Obviously, it's a problem of culture, and it might take time.
So this is where corporate innovation culture, old corporate cultures have a very big impact on the startup ecosystem and culture and valuations in Europe. I'd like to thank Alberto, Robin, Sean for the panel. We're going to move on next. Please give them a hand.